I was sentenced to 30 years. Pretty much thought my life was over as I knew it. I was 35. My only possibility of surviving was just to take 300% responsibility for having got myself in there. Suddenly felt this absolute certainty that no matter what happened the next day, I wouldn't give up. And I was able to start 2 national organizations that catalyzed 2 national movements. I was able to do all kinds of things that prisoners are not supposed to be able to do. If it's not in flow, it's got to go.
Imagine being in a federal prison, realizing that no one is coming to save you, and deciding that moment would define the rest of your life. That single decision turned today's guest into a founder, a Zen teacher, and a coach to some of the world's top leaders. Some stories don't just inspire, they challenge what we think is possible. Today's guest didn't just survive a 14-year federal prison sentence. He used that time to launch 2 national movements that reshaped how we view mindfulness and compassionate care behind bars. He went on to become a Zen Roshi, an Inc. 5000 entrepreneur, and a coach to CEOs who want to lead with clarity, courage, and purpose. His philosophy, radical responsibility, teaches that we reclaim our power the moment we stop blaming and start owning our choices. And his work brings together 50 years of meditation, neuroscience, and leadership experience. Today, we're exploring resilience, inner mastery, and what it truly means to turn pain into purpose. I'm Linda Vogt, and this is Inspired by Success. Let's welcome to the show, Fleet Maull. Welcome to the show, Fleet.
Hi, Linda. Thank you for having me.
Fleet, you went from a federal prison cell to coaching visionary CEOs. Tell me about that time. And when you look back, was there a single moment that you realized that no one was coming to save you, that you were the only one that could change your life?
Yeah, well, I think there were a lot of moments. There was a particular moment, just to give people a little background. I'm a baby boomer who came up through the counterculture age and graduated from high school as kind of a classic angry young man. I grew up in a good middle-class family, but we had alcoholism and different things. And so, whatever, I had kind of a hole in my gut and went headlong into the counterculture of that time. I was also always a spiritual seeker, always interested in the mind, always pretty entrepreneurial. Anyway, before I could untangle all of that, I earned my way into a federal prison sentence for drug trafficking. I ended up living in South America as kind of a very alienated expat for some time and got into small-scale drug smuggling to just kind of live outside the system and justified that with all this us versus them thinking. It's something I deeply regret today and wish I had done something more creative with my anger. And I really regret the harm that my involvement in drugs had on anyone. I do feel good about what I did with the time once I got locked up, just to give people a little of the backstory. But by the time I got locked up, I had a lot of training. Some people, they hear my story, they think I probably discovered meditation in prison, but no, I had been meditating for a long time. I'd actually done a 3-year clinical training program, and there was an integration of Buddhist and Western psychology and psychotherapy, an unusually deep master's level program. Been interested in practicing Buddhist meditation, particularly for about 15 years, and very actively working with a teacher for 10 years and keeping this other part of my life secret. And I had this kind of split life. I'd spent about half the year doing really good, positive things, another part of the year doing the craziness associated with being involved with drugs. So, and again, before I could untangle all that, I earned my way into a federal prison sentence. And initially, I refused to testify or cooperate against anyone, not because I was trying to be a tough guy or a stand-up guy. I was a Buddhist, and I just couldn't see, someone else is going to suffer instead of me. Someone else's children are going to suffer instead of me. I'm going to trade my time for somebody else's suffering. I couldn't do that. Because of that, I became designated as what they call the Kingpin, and then everybody else gets deals, and you become the center of the thing. And so I ended up doing a lot of people's time. I could have focused on that. I chose not to, and I'll explain why in a moment. I went to trial only because I was indicted on 5 counts. One of them was this so-called Kingpin statute, was called continuous criminal enterprise. It's basically a criminal RICO statute, if people are familiar with that. It's a conspiracy statute. And it's very hard to defend yourself again because conspiracy laws are kind of whatever they want them to be. So, but anyway, I went to trial and I was convicted on all 5 accounts. And that one count, the continuous criminal enterprise count, carried a no parole sentence. And I could have gotten anywhere from 10 to life. So when I was facing sentencing, I was potentially facing a life sentence. And if I had received life, I'd still be in prison today because the only thing that would have got me out would have been a presidential pardon. And those don't happen unless you're obviously very well connected or wealthy or something. I was sentenced to 30 years. I was hoping for maybe more like 15. I got sentenced to 30. My knees buckled when I was sentenced, and Pretty much thought my life was over as I knew it. I was 35. The next day in the paper, it said I'd be 65 before I had any chance of release. And I was absolutely devastated over what I'd done to my son, who was 9 years old at the time, and leaving him to grow up without a dad. Just absolutely devastated over what I'd done to him, what I'd done to myself, my own life, and how I'd let down my family and my teachers, my community, and so forth. And so I became radically motivated to turn my life around and just focus on how to take whatever talents I had and whatever I'd received from my family and my upbringing, my teachers, and do something good with it. And to leave a better legacy for my son than just his dad went to prison or even that his dad died in prison, because I had no surety that I would survive my time. It wasn't until I'd been in prison for a while that I figured out that fortunately I was sentenced under the old federal laws prior to 1987, where if you stayed out of trouble, you got a lot of what they called good time. I didn't realize that until I'd been in prison for months, kind of figured it out because they don't tell you that if I stayed out of trouble on 30 years, I'd serve 18 and a half. But if you get in trouble, every time you get in trouble for something in prison, they take it away in chunks, right? And I've heard some prisoners probably say, I do my time day for day, which I don't think is something to be proud of, but some people get weird ideas in their head, right? I could have ended up doing the whole 30 years, right? Then it took about 2.5 years for my appeal to go through the courts. And on appeal, they dropped off one count, not the worst count with the no parole sentence, but one count. That reduced my aggregate sentence to 25. So then at that point, I knew I'd do 14 and a half if I stayed out of trouble, right? And it's not easy to stay out of trouble in prison. So at that point, I still had 12 to go, which still felt like forever, right? And so I had no surety that I would survive my time, and I really wanted to leave a better legacy for my son than just his dad went to prison or died in prison. I did my time at the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisons, which is the maximum security federal prison hospital that geographically just happened to be the federal prison nearest where I was sentenced in the Midwest. And all the patients there were from the highest security federal penitentiaries. Now, the general population was more like medium level, which I was. Some of the people in the so-called work cadre of general population who were just there to help run the place. Some of them had worked their way down from higher security places, and some got sentenced there like I did. It wasn't as dangerous of a place as a full-on penitentiary, but it was close. Of course, there were people dying there from illnesses left and right because it was a hospital, but there were also people dying of violence, and it was a lot of violence, and that was the kind of situation. But I realized right off the bat, fortunately, because I'd had enough training already, that my only possibility of surviving was just to take 300% responsibility for having got myself in there and what I was going to do with it. That was just absolutely clear to me. The other thing that was really clear to me was that I was in an incredibly negative and corrosive environment. Everybody had a big victim story. All the prisoners had their own victim stories, even though society perceives them as perpetrators. They all feel victimized by the system. And most of them end up in prison because they were victimized severely as children to begin with. That's just, they get programmed to end up in prison. I'm certainly not in any way blaming my past on having got myself in there. But really, when you really understand the background of most prisoners, it's like no wonder they're there. So in many cases, you wonder why they're still alive. There's a lot of racism and bigotry and just negativity and violence. And I realized very quickly that if I wasn't really proactive about being very vigilant about guarding my own mind and my own heart, that I could end up that way. I didn't want to end up that way. If I ever got out, I certainly didn't want to come out bitter and broken with a bad attitude, but I didn't want to live that way in prison either. So I knew right from the beginning that I had to be really proactive about taking everything I'd been learning for the last 20 years and apply that to how I was going to live in that environment, how I could show up and be of value in that environment, and how I could create any possibility of a future life for myself. And the other thing I'll just say, when I was awaiting sentencing and I was facing a potential life sentence the next day, suddenly felt this absolute certainty that no matter what happened the next day, I wouldn't give up. I wouldn't give up on myself. I wouldn't give up on my son. I wouldn't give up on life. And that was really a very powerful moment for me. I took the Buddhist precepts and took monastic vows, living as a monastic in the prison, and really focused on building a strong ethical foundation in my life. And I realized anything I was going to be able to do in that environment was going to come out of that. It wasn't going to come out of me saying, oh, we should do this or that, or trying. It was going to come organically out of me totally dedicating myself to my practice and really walking the walk. That's where this whole approach to radical responsibility began.
Well, that's a very interesting and inspiring concept, because a lot of people that go behind bars, some of them either stay victims and just don't make anything out of their lives, or they can flip it around and use that adversity as fuel and drive. And I've spoken to a couple of people that are really inspiring, have been in prison and have actually got out of prison and just changed and built something amazing from the adversity and to things that they've learned and read inside prison as well. So I'm curious to know, like, from prison, how did you use the lessons that you learned? You mentioned you were a monk in doing that inside prison, and how did that come about to shifting after you got released and applying that to build what you've built now and coming this far?
Let me just say a little bit something about the lessons that I learned. So I was in a maximum security prison, which sociologists call a total institution, which means it's a totalitarian environment, right? The authorities have 100% power and resistance is futile. And where I was, they had both a medical ward. There were about 1,000 patients there, 600 medical, 400 psychiatric, and then there were 300 in what they call the work cadre, who were there just to help run the place. I taught school for 14 years, helping other prisoners learn to read or get their GED and so forth, or study for college courses. So my day job was teaching school for 14 years. If you ever approached any staff about, could we do this? Could we try that? The answer was always no. And if you were bold enough to ask why, which was enough to get in trouble, they always had a story about how, well, we used to do that, but some inmate abused it and blah, 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 blah. So the answer to everything is no. Resistance is futile. And there, actually, if you really try to buck the system, you'd be back in the psych ward in 4-point restraints, being pumped full of Helidol at night and hosed down, really naked in 4-point restraints on a concrete bunk. It was really that serious. I had a lot of time to serve, and for most prisoners, they consider prison time just downtime, and they try to numb themselves out and sleep through it, just get through it. I had been a practitioner enough and had enough training to realize I don't want to throw this part of my life away. This is a big chunk of my life. I don't want to throw it away. In fact, I'm going to learn everything I can from it. I want to continue to grow spiritually and emotionally and psychologically. And so I wanted to be fully awake in there. And I also wanted to add value. I wanted to contribute. So how do you get anything done in an environment like that where you have no power? It's the most powerless situation anybody could imagine being in, basically. Fortunately, my first spiritual teacher, my first Buddhist teacher, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, a great Tibetan meditation master, really emphasized skillfulness, that he wasn't concerned about justice or injustice. He wasn't concerned about right and wrong. Is that he was saying what was most important was what works, what creates benefit, and what creates harm. What's skillful, what's not skillful, right? In terms of what's actually beneficial for ourselves and others and what's not beneficial for ourselves and others, right? So that was my focus. How can I be skillful in this environment? How do I work with people? How do I interact with others? How do I interact with my fellow prisoners? How do I interact with the guards? How do I interact with the prison administrators to get stuff done? A lot of prisoners, instead, they try to fight court cases and then they get shipped out. Adversarial approach, which you pay for. They've won some battles. I even benefited from some of the laws, but most of those have been eroded by now by the courts. I chose the path of skillfulness, right? And in doing so, I was able to start all kinds of programs in the prison. I was able to start 2 national organizations that catalyzed 2 national movements. I was able to do all kinds of things that prisoners are not supposed to be able to do. And in fact, when I was released, I later was in touch with various wardens and former wardens, and they were like, how did you do that? You're not supposed to do that. It all came from that approach of skillfulness. When I first started working in the education department as a school teacher, there was already a prisoner there who was actually kind of doing some interesting stuff, doing some interesting courses and so forth. And I was saying, how do you do this? Because I already knew, like, the answer to everything is no. He said, first of all, if you want to try to do something, first of all, check inside and make sure that your motives are really clean. And then assume all of the authority you need to get it done and not 1 ounce more. And as soon as you don't need that anymore, let it go. And I found that really sage advice. But to point to how I learned to be skillful, and also to point to the fact that a lot of us think we can't do much, I'm just one person. Well, actually, most of the major changes in the world, positive changes, have been started by very small groups of people. Everybody's a human being. Everybody has their fear button. Everybody has their control button. If they're a correctional professional, they have their police button, right? Their authority button. You don't want to push those buttons, but everybody's got their human button. And you got to find that. And not to manipulate people, but by being honest and straightforward with people. That led to me being able to step out and start a consulting business, which I did immediately stepping out of prison. I did a lot of free consulting for people, learning the trade for 6 months, and I got my first client 6 months out, negotiated a $5,000 a month retainer with this small company that needed to transform itself, and I was off and running. My niche became mostly long-term change management engagements with smaller privately held companies. I did some work in big Fortune 500 companies. I didn't like it so much. It was pretty political, hard to really make a difference. Companies that were anywhere from 25 to 300 employees to around 30 million in sales, 5 to 30 million in revenue, where
Okay.
I could have a direct relationship with the CEO. Those were the companies where I could really make a difference. And that became my work for the first 20 years out of prison.
How do you apply that to entrepreneurs and helping? Because you've got a lot of skills and you can teach the Zen, especially for an entrepreneur who might be going through a lot of chaos and pressure. And I believe that combining the two, having the entrepreneurship, the skills there, but also having that mindfulness. And I've seen successful people meditate, really successful entrepreneurs, and they always mention meditation as well. So how do you combine that? And what advice do you have for an entrepreneur that might be going through a lot of growth or just a lot happening in their lives, but they need to
Well,
reset? If
well,
a
I
leader
think
only has 5 minutes a day to reset their mind and body, what's the simplest thing they could do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the foundational human skills, really, for life altogether, are self awareness and self regulation. Developing
Mm.
some awareness of our own thoughts, emotions, and neurophysiology, how we feel, being in our bodies, listening to our bodies, developing some level of self awareness, and then having skills for self regulation. To realize when we're too upregulated or we're getting upset, that we have a way to come back into a more regulated state, gain access to the smart part of our brain, and make better decisions. I mean, that's just foundational for life, but we're not taught that. That's not really taught in school. For leaders and entrepreneurs, it's even more important, right? And to be able to show up and lead your company in a way that is really going to enroll people in your vision and be able to create a thriving company, a thriving enterprise where people feel valued and they're able to use their own intelligence and wisdom and creativity to help move a company, move an enterprise forward. You as the CEO, your ability to be in a well-regulated, open, relational, balanced state really sets the tone for the whole company, right? So it's really critically important. For the first 20 years coming out of prison, I was basically a solopreneur. When I decided to start HeartMind, really build a team and build a company, I'd already had a lot of skills because as a solopreneur, I had to do all my own marketing. I had to keep a pipeline of potential clients. There was nobody else. You're doing every role of a company when you're a solopreneur. So you learn a lot. And then HeartMind really took off during the pandemic. It was kind of a perfect storm for what we did. And it grew very quickly. At the beginning of 2023, we just had four of us. It was myself, my business partner, my wife, one other employee. Now we have a core team of 11 or 12 and probably 7 or 8 contractors. We've grown exponentially. The challenges of managing a company and leading a company grow exponentially. The skills and the knowledge it takes to operate a 6-figure business are very different than what it takes to operate a 7-figure business or an 8-figure business. So as you're growing, you have to grow with the company. You have to change. Your mindset has to change. Your skill set has to change. Your role's going to change, right? You have to be able to effectively manage a group of people and give them enough free rein to be innovative and creative, but at the same time, keep everybody on the reservation, following your vision for what you're trying to do with your company. And the way you're going to learn the most and learn the most quickly is by being fully present with an open mind in a highly relational, well-regulated state. How do you do that? You do that with all the inner mastery skills. You do it with meditation. You do it with the ability, you're just going to continually learn. You learn to live in a state of not knowing. You learn to live with uncertainty and learn from uncertainty. Rather than trying to, I know the way it is and I want to control this. No, you just got to be in like every moment. Every moment it's new, it's changing, and you're learning and you're learning and you're learning. You got to be in the game and willing to make decisions. But at the same time, you got to be in this constant state of openness. There's something from my Zen training that has been very helpful to me. We have what we call the 3 tenets of peacemaking. And the first one is not knowing, which is letting go of fixed ideas about ourselves, others, and the world, which I think is what about all the inner technologies of all the world's spiritual traditions, shamanic traditions are all about. How do you get out of conditioned mind into total openness, right? It's much easier said than done.
What's the secret weapon behind every top CEO and entrepreneur? A game-changing executive assistant. Hermesi gives you access to elite EAs who supercharge your productivity. From payroll and admin to social media and customer support, they handle it all so you can focus on growth and big picture decisions. These aren't your average assistants. They're expertly trained, thoroughly screened, and equipped with the latest AI tools to work smarter and faster. Ready to delegate and dominate? Get 15% off your first 2 months with code INSPIRE15. Don't wait. Visit Hermessi, that's HERMESSI.com, and take back your time today.
So letting go of all our fixed opinions to actually face reality. And the second tenet is bearing witness, which means staying in the seat, staying in the game, bearing witness to reality, letting yourself be touched by the joy and suffering of life, really facing reality without the protection of our knowing and our biases and all that. The third that comes out of that quite naturally is wisdom-based action, right? So as an entrepreneur, if you can't deal with uncertainty, you're not going to be much of an entrepreneur. With AI, everything is changing so quickly. You just got to be there in the seat, riding the horse and learning and learning and learning. And if you're willing to do that, you become more and more skillful all the time and wiser, and you make better decisions.
Speaking of wisdom, right? A lot of successful people use their pain. They probably mask their pain. One of my guests told me that if you have a drive that's coming from a wound, it's not healthy. So how can you tell if someone has a drive for success, but that drive is coming from stress or trauma instead of from wisdom? Because you mentioned wisdom.
A lot of people that are very successful and they've been driven by fear, they've been driven by childhood experiences. There's a lot of entrepreneurs, it's very common, that grew up in poverty and they just said, I never want to live like that. I want my family to experience that. And there's nothing wrong with any of that. Whatever inspires entrepreneurs, great. But if your motivation, your drive, and your inspiration is primarily driven by those kind of experiences and those kind of emotions, sooner or later, it's going to push you towards burnout. So how do you know the difference, whether you're in flow or not? Is my life in balance, right? Am I creating success at the expense of my marriage, my relationship, or my health, or my children, right? And we're never going to have perfect life balance, but if you're not constantly working at life balance, you're headed towards burnout, right? And so this whole thing, when your relationships are in flow, when you own your own health and well-being's in flow, right? I was in a partnership for a while, just wasn't working. And I knew it wasn't working and I wasn't happy. I knew it was going to be very painful to undo this. And so I was just dealing with it for the time being, right? Even though it was gnawing away at me because it just felt like it had really become inequitable and so forth. So I was over in Asia, actually in Nepal, a retreat with my Tibetan teacher there. I had a medical emergency while I was over there. My small intestine decided to twist up and get blocked, and I ended up in the emergency room. I very easily could have died. They had me on a ventilator during the surgery, but the first 2 times they tried to get me off the ventilator, I didn't start breathing. And I was suddenly awake and not breathing. And I had that experience twice. It was quite scary. I guess they reintubated me both times, and eventually they were able to get me off, and I survived and I was fine. But having gone through that, it was absolutely clear to me that when I got back, I was dissolving that partnership. And it became clear to me, I had this mantra, if it's not in flow, it's got to go. And if it is only some kind of trauma or some kind of negative or some kind of fear, eventually that's going to drive you towards the shadow side of entrepreneurship, and it's going to drive you to burnout. So the way you know is, am I in a creative flow? Am I having fun? I mean, that's one thing. Entrepreneurship should be fun. If you're not having fun, you've lost the inspiration.
Talk about the shadow part of entrepreneurship. I'm curious to know, what's the shadow part of that? Burnout is one thing.
The shadow part is probably manifested in a number of ways, but basically when entrepreneurship is purely a survival strategy. And I don't just mean survival to make money, because at some point you could just have a lifestyle business and have a decent income and survive. If you're really driven by fear and survival, that's what's going to create all the shadow stuff. That's going to get you to cut the ethical edges. That's going to get you into greed. It's going to get you into never being satisfied, never enough. It's going to get you to push for success at the expense of your relationships and your health and well-being, or at the well-being of your employees. You're going to cut corners because you're still driven by this fear, the survival fear, right? Good to know that we all have that in us, right? Because we have a basic operating system that's there to keep us alive. Our ancestors, way, way back, they were genetically optimized to be pretty fearful. So we have this operating system in us that's all about fear and survival, but we're also conscious human beings, and we don't need to let that run the show. But for a lot of us, that will run the show because of past traumas and childhood experiences and various things. So if our fear and survival programming is running our life as an entrepreneur, that's going to create all the shadow manifestations, right? The most common and immediately personal one is we're going to chase success at the expense of our own well-being and the expense of our family and so forth. But the second one that'll come online pretty quickly is we'll start cutting corners ethically.
There's a couple of things that just I'm curious to know about that never enough, that always wanting more as well. What's the balance between that? Because I feel like I want to be a growth mindset and growth oriented. When I hit a certain goal, I want to hit another bigger goal. It's never going to stop for me. That's me personally. I feel like I want to make an impact and help others because of that growth, not because it's just like a fuel for something. If you're not growing, you're dying.
Our HeartMind, we're very much, and we have a whole part of it that's very involved with entrepreneurship training, but we're mostly have been involved in the personal evolution, personal growth, self-help space, right? And people often talk about self-improvement. Even that phrase, self-improvement, sometimes get criticized because the whole idea of self-improvement seems to indicate there's something missing or something wrong with us to begin with, right? So a lot of people, especially in the worlds I've come from Dharma worlds and Buddhist worlds and spiritual worlds, they say, oh, self-improvement, that's bad because they're not recognizing that they're fine to begin with. They already have divine nature, Buddha nature, and all that. I say, that's all well and good. Yes, I don't think it's helpful to strive from a place of lack or strive from a place of I'm not good enough, right? In fact, I think we need to really do our own contemplative work to discover that place in ourselves where we recognize that I am absolutely unconditionally whole, good, wise, intelligent, beautiful human being right now. And I don't need to do anything to increase. In fact, I couldn't increase that if I wanted to. It's already there, right? So there really is no lack. And with contemplative tools, with meditation experiences, we can drop into the depth of our being where we realize the truth of our own, what my first teacher called basic goodness, our own innate, unconditional basic goodness. And once we experience that, nobody can take that away from us. And we realize all the messages of not enoughness we've been getting our whole life are lies, right? And of course, we have a whole consumer society built on the message of not enoughness, right? You're not enough, but if you buy this product, at least you might be cool and enough and somebody might love you at least till the next gadget comes out, right? That's kind of our whole consumer society is built around that. You need to do the work to find that confidence and faith in your own innate goodness so you're not driven by lack. But then apart from that, well, once I realized, I already have Buddha nature, I'm already complete, I'm already wise. Why do anything? Because as human beings, we're designed to thrive like any life form. Trees don't remain a seed, right? They grow into beautiful, great big trees, right? We're designed to thrive. And really, if we just remove the fear blockages, we will naturally thrive and grow and add value. And I want to contribute as much as I can in this lifetime with whatever talents and abilities I have, because that's just being in the flow of life, right? If I'm not doing that, it's only nothing but fear keeping me from doing that. If I'm playing small, it's nothing but fear keeping me doing that, right? And that doesn't mean I have to go out and become king of the world. It's just like, what are my opportunities to create value with whatever talents I have? Just be in that flow. If you're creating value in life, you're going to receive value. And you can just trust that.
That's true. But when a founder feels stuck or up against their real limits, what's the first mindset shift you help them make?
It's about everything we've been talking about. Because when we get stuck, there's some kind of fear and survival thing at play. And people use different terms. We have blueprints or we have standards, and they operate kind of like a thermostat, right? And where did we get them? We inherited them from our family. We didn't create them. We absorbed them from our family, from our culture, from whatever, right? And we all have an internal blueprint where we know that I'm allowed to be this successful. I'm allowed to make this much money. I should make at least this much money or at least be this successful. There's some kind of band in there where I need to be. And if I get below that, I'm going to get busy to get back to where I need to be. But if I start getting up too high, I'll unconsciously sabotage myself to get back in that zone where I think it's okay to be. It's a completely unconscious process. Now, you can get up when you're hitting the top of that thing, you can struggle and try to struggle against it and push yourself through it, which is really hard to do and very counterproductive. The thing is, what you want to do is go in and change the blueprint, change the thermostat setting. So if your thermostat setting is set, it's okay if I make $100,000 a year, but not anymore, because if I make more than that, I must be a greedy person. It's way more than my parents made. I can't feel good about my whatever internal thing. It's usually completely unconscious. First of all, you have to do the inner work to get clear about, and this is the work you can do with a coach, right? You can figure out what your blueprint is. You can listen, pay attention to your self-talk. You can journal about your self-talk, and keeping a journal, I think, is a really important, valuable tool for all of us, but especially for entrepreneurs, so that you're paying attention to your own inner life on a daily basis and listening to your self-talk. Because if you listen to that channel between your ears, it'll lay out the whole blueprint for you if you pay attention to it. You journal on it, work with a coach on it, you'll be You'll understand the blueprint. You'll understand how you got it. And once you got it, you can see, okay, this is just something I inherited. It's not real. Now, how do I change it? Well, you change it through lots of means, through different kind of visualizations and affirmations. And the whole idea of manifesting is very popular, right? Of course, there's the kind of woo-woo pseudoscience kind of manifesting, right? Maybe on some quantum level, if somebody was a good enough dreamer, they could do it. I don't know. But there is a real science of manifestation. And really, all that science is how you change your own brain, change your own neural architecture, right? When I wake up every morning, I spend the first hour doing what I call a practice stack of various body mind practices that I'm stacking, and I'm experimenting with that stack all the time. I do that for an hour. Then I go do my shower and do the cold shower, cold immersion. Then I go meet my wife and I do our Tibetan Vajrayana practice, another hour and a half practice. So I spend the first 2.5 hours of every day working on myself and self care and self help, personal evolution work. But that practice stack I do, it involves breath work, it involves yoga, it involves affirmations, it involves gratitude work, it involves visualizations. I'm really priming my mind. And by the time I get to the end of that hour, I have absolute clarity about who I am, what I'm creating in my life, what I'm inspired to do in a state of practically ecstasy and bliss and complete positive energy with a clear vision of the future that I'm stepping into. So by doing that every morning, I'm literally transforming my neural architecture, literally physically. I mean, if you put me in an MRI, you'd see the changes. And also, I'm programming my subconscious mind so that I will follow through and step into the opportunities I have to create what I am inspired to create in life, right? That's how you change those blueprints. It's just programming. So how do you change that programming? You reprogram yourself. Anything that creates greater neuroplasticity, because then your brain and your neural architecture is more changeable, and then focus on getting really clear about who you are and what you want. I think a lot of us way underplay our lives because we don't feel any permission to even think about what I really want. A lot of times consultants, coaches have you sit down and write a whole list. I want this, I want this, I want. For a lot of people, it's really hard to do. It sounds so selfish. Oh, I can't do that. Oh, I don't have permission to do that, right? You have to give yourself permission to let your true talents and being come out. If we don't do the work to get absolutely clear about who we are, what our values are, and what we want in life, then in today's world, you may as well just open up all the windows and doors and just let yourself be driven thither and fro by everybody that's trying to monetize your attention and market this to you, market that to you, and wrap you up in all the negativity of the news and politics and everything else. You're just going to be a complete victim of your childhood programming and the world around you. Right? We all live in an interface between whatever childhood programming we got and the world around us. And neither one of those are completely benevolent, right? And if they were, you could maybe be kind of mindlessly in there and it'd be okay. But for the most part, they're not. So we're in there just kind of getting shoved around until we decide, no, I'm going to learn to self regulate. I'm going to get in the driver's seat of my own life. Then we're not really living our life. There's no limit to how we can reprogram ourselves.
Yeah, I definitely believe that. I agree with what you do in the morning. I try to put some time aside for a little bit of meditation, prayer, and I try to squeeze in visualization, but an hour, that's really impressive what you do. And then you mentioned that you do it with your wife as well.
We're both Buddhists. Our core practice tradition is Tibetan Buddhism. But they've been doing this practice stacking for a long time. So hour to an hour and a half practice includes basic meditation, breath work, posture, includes visualization, it includes liturgical work, which actually is a form of affirmations. Your core practice in that tradition, you call it a sadhana, right? That's a practice session. And it includes probably a dozen different body mind technologies. And they've been evolving that over thousands of years, right? What I do is my own experimental one that I'm involving, just pulling from ancient stuff and modern stuff and from neuroscience and biofield science and from quantum work and breath work. I'm just constantly experimenting because I'm trying to prime myself into the ideal physiological and mental state to have a fabulous day and be as creative as I can possibly be. And also to stay clear on who I am and what I want. I've done the work to get clear about how I can bring value to life, right? Because there's a million things out there to do, and you can start chasing shiny balls all over the place. No, I know this is my direction. This is my lane. and I'm going to succeed in this lane. So I want to stay focused there.
Yes, I agree. And you mentioned a lot of things like quantum physics and creating your own reality. And I love that stuff because usually it doesn't tie in with business and entrepreneurship. But if you can be successful and learn and be open to help the mind improve and self-develop, it's really powerful and you can apply it into entrepreneurship. So I'm curious to know, with all that knowledge, which is the most impactful books that you've read? Because you've got a whole heap behind you, but which books have had a huge impact on who you are today and how you've grown the most?
Well, my first spiritual teacher's books had a huge impact on my life. Books like Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism and Myth of Freedom and Shambhala's Sacred Path of the Warrior, Turning the Mind into an Ally, like a friend, making a friend of your own mind.
Is that a book?
Yeah, that's a book. So there's a lot of spiritual books, and I could name a lot more that have been very powerful for me and continue to be. I'm constantly studying and reading. But in terms of business books, Dan Sullivan's books, Who Not How, 10X is Easier than 2X, are both very powerful. Dan Martell's book, Buy Back Your Time. I'm reading a dozen books all the time. To me, successful entrepreneurs are learners. If you read about the life of the most successful entrepreneurs, they're all learners and they're all constantly reading, constantly studying. And, now with AI, there's some really great things you can do. I was recently at an AI mastermind training with Mike Kennicks, who's become a colleague and a mentor. And he takes, like, if he wants to learn something, he'll go out and find the best YouTube videos on some skill, right? So how to use some AI tool to do this or do that, and find the ones that have the most views, that are the most recent, that seem most up to date, get the best ones. And then you can feed that into an AI, and then he's developed prompts to take that and turn that into, which would take you maybe 6 hours to watch all that and absorb all that, to condense it down to a 20-minute summary that's delivered to you like a podcast, right? And you can listen to, right? And that's just one way to do it. You can also condense books. I actually like to read complete books, and I like to listen to complete books. I sometimes do, some of the services like Blink and those kind of things to get just a summary of a book, the Crip Notes version. But I really like full books as well. So I do both, right? But it's really all about the most successful entrepreneurs are lifelong learners, and they get better and better at finding the information that they need, processing that information, and turning it into actionable creativity, right? And AI is giving us a lot of new tools to do that, right? And really accelerating the process. But it's really about being a learner and having this thirst for learning and figuring out new and better ways to do things.
Powerful. Finally, where can people find you if they want to connect with you and work with you?
So heartmind.co, heartmind.co, not com, but heartmind.co is our basic website. You can find all about our online summits and courses there. People can also go to fleetmaull.com and learn about all my background and the prison work and all the rest of it. If entrepreneurs may be particularly interested, and we have a bootcamp mastermind program. It's a 6-month intensive with really the leading entrepreneurs, some of the leading entrepreneurs in the world. Some of the books I just mentioned are on the faculty. Very intensive 6-month program designed for early stage entrepreneurs to really guarantee their success. And people can find that at entrepreneurialmasterymba.com.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time, Fleet. It's been awesome.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.